March 5, 1944, Tempelhof Airfield, Berlin. The morning air is cold enough to burn the lungs. On the concrete apron, still dark with overnight frost, a captured American fighter sits under guard. Its aluminum skin catches the weak sunlight like polished silver. Oberstleutnant Hans-Ekkehard Bob approaches slowly, his boots echoing across the empty tarmac. He is 26 years old and has 60 confirmed kills. He has flown against Spitfires over Britain, Hurricanes over France, Yaks over Russia. He knows aircraft the way a surgeon knows anatomy, by instinct, by touch, by the weight of experience. But he has never seen anything like this. The aircraft is a North American P-51 Mustang. It was forced down 2 days ago near Stuttgart, its pilot now a prisoner, the machine itself intact enough for evaluation. Bob circles it once, taking in the lines, sleek, purposeful, predatory. The nose is long. The canopy is a bubble of plexiglass, offering 360-degree visibility. The wings are thin, laminar flow, designed with an aerodynamic sophistication that makes his own Messerschmitt Bf 109 look brutish by comparison. He climbs onto the wing, slides back the canopy, settles into the cockpit. The seat fits like a tailor-made suit. The instruments are cleanly arranged, logically positioned. The control stick falls naturally to hand. Everything about the ergonomics speaks of careful thought, of engineers who understood that a pilot's efficiency is measured in seconds, and that seconds decide who lives and who burns. But it is not the cockpit that troubles him. It is what he saw when the ground crew removed the external fuel tanks. The Mustang carries enough fuel to fly from England to Berlin and back again. Bob sits in silence for a long moment, his hands resting on the controls of an enemy aircraft, and feels something rare for a man who has survived 4 years of air combat. He feels certainty, not about victory or skill or courage, certainty about the end. The Luftwaffe is finished. In 1940, the North American P-51 Mustang did not exist. The United States Army Air Corps had no immediate need for a new fighter. American aircraft manufacturers were occupied filling orders for the British and French, churning out P-40 Warhawks and other designs already in production. But the British Purchasing Commission, desperate for aircraft of any kind, approached North American Aviation with a request. Could they build Curtiss P-40 Send under license to supplement RAF fighter strength? James Dutch Kindelberger, president of North American Aviation, made a counteroffer. Instead of building someone else's obsolete design, his engineers could design a superior fighter from scratch in the same time frame. The British were skeptical but intrigued. They gave North American 120 days to produce a prototype. The design team, led by Edgar Schmood, worked with ferocious intensity. They studied every fighter in service, catalogued every flaw, compiled every lesson learned from the air war over Europe. They incorporated laminar flow wings for reduced drag. They mounted the engine low and behind the pilot for better weight distribution. They positioned the radiator beneath the fuselage in a duct that actually generated forward thrust from the cooling airflow, a feature so clever it bordered on sorcery. The prototype flew in October 1940, 102 days after the contract was signed. Early Mustangs were fast, faster than anything the Luftwaffe flew at low altitude, but they were powered by Allison engines that lost performance above 15,000 feet, limiting their utility as high-altitude interceptors or bomber escorts. The RAF used them for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack, roles where their speed and agility shone, but they were not yet war winners. Then, in 1942, someone had an idea that changed everything. Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew a Mustang and was impressed by its handling. He reported back to his superiors, "What if we put a Merlin engine in this aircraft?" The Merlin, the same supercharged V-12 that powered Spitfires and Hurricanes, had exceptional high-altitude performance. Mated to the Mustang's low-drag airframe, it might create something extraordinary. The marriage of British engine and American airframe was consummated in late 1942. The result was designated the P-51B. It could fly at 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. It could outclimb, outturn, and outrun every fighter in the Luftwaffe inventory. And with external drop tanks, it had a combat radius of 850 miles. 850 miles, enough to escort bombers from England to Berlin and engage enemy fighters the entire way. The 8th Air Force received its first P-51Bs in December 1943. By March 1944, entire fighter groups had transitioned to the type. For the first time in the war, American heavy bombers penetrating deep into the Reich would have fighter escort all the way to the target and back. The Luftwaffe, which had built its defensive doctrine around the assumption that enemy fighters had limited range, was about to learn what obsolescence felt like. German fighter pilots in early 1944 were not naive. They knew the Americans had numerical superiority. They knew the tide had turned, but they also knew their aircraft were excellent. Their tactics were refined, and their advantage in experience was significant. A veteran Luftwaffe pilot in a Focke-Wulf 190 could hold his own against a dozen opponents if he fought smart, diving through formations, making slashing attacks, refusing to be drawn into turning dogfights where numbers mattered. The key to their survival was geography. American bombers launching from England had to cross hundreds of miles of occupied territory to reach industrial targets in central Germany. Their fighter escorts put Morty-7 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings had limited range. They could accompany the bombers partway, perhaps to the German border, but no farther. Beyond that point, the bombers were naked, and the Luftwaffe owned the sky. This was the killing zone, the deep interior of the Reich, where German fighters could mass against undefended bomber formations, making repeated attack runs without fear of enemy fighters. It was brutally effective. In October 1943, a raid against Schweinfurt cost the Americans 77 bombers and 600 crewmen in a single afternoon. The losses were unsustainable. The 8th Air Force briefly suspended deep penetration raids, unable to continue bleeding at such rates. German pilots called this period Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. They knew it would not last forever. They knew American industry would eventually produce enough bombers to overwhelm German defenses through sheer attrition. But they believed they had time. Time to train new pilots. Time to deploy jet fighters still in development. Time to fortify the Reich's airspace into an impenetrable fortress. Then the Mustangs arrived, and time ran out. The first indication came in late December 1943, when Luftwaffe controllers began reporting American fighters appearing over targets that should have been beyond escort range. Initial reports were dismissed as misidentifications, perhaps detached P-47s that had pushed their fuel limits. But the reports continued. By January there was no denying it, the Americans had a long-range fighter. Luftwaffe intelligence officers interrogated captured pilots, studied gun camera footage, analyzed wreckage. The aircraft was identified as the P-51 Mustang, a type previously encountered only in low-level operations. But these new variants were different. They carried additional fuel tanks under the wings. They operated at altitudes above 25,000 feet, and their pilots were aggressive, seeking combat rather than merely defending the bombers. German fighter commanders held emergency conferences. The tactical situation had fundamentally changed. The Mustangs could escort bombers all the way to Berlin, Dresden, Munich, anywhere. There would be no more safe zones, no more killing fields where Luftwaffe fighters could attack unmolested. Every interception would now be contested. Every mission would mean fighting through a screen of American fighters that were faster, had more fuel, and were present in overwhelming numbers. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, reportedly told his staff, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." But knowing and experiencing are different things. Lieutenant Heinz Nock was a 22-year-old fighter pilot with 33 victories. On March 6, 1944, he took off from Oldenburg to intercept a formation of American Bear-17C heading toward Berlin. It was a clear day, visibility unlimited, the kind of weather where bomber formations stood out like dark clouds against blue sky. Noak's unit, 12 Bf 109S, climbed to 28,000 feet and positioned themselves in the sun, preparing for a diving attack. Standard procedure. They had done this 100 times. As they rolled into their attack dive, tracer fire laced past Noakes' canopy from behind. He pulled hard, reversing his turn, and saw them Mustangs, 6 of them silver aircraft with blue noses, already inside firing range. They had approached from above and behind, using the sun the same way Noakes' unit had intended to use it. Now the roles were reversed. The hunters were the hunted. What followed was chaos. The P-109 Secker scattered, each pilot fighting his own individual battle for survival. Noakes fired at a Mustang that crossed in front of him, saw his rounds strike the wing, but could not follow up because another Mustang was on his tail, forcing him into a spiral dive. He pulled out at 5,000 feet, engines screaming, and looked around. The sky was empty. The bombers were gone, continuing to Berlin unmolested. Of his 12 aircraft formation, 3 were missing. They had not fired a single shot at the bombers. This became the pattern. German fighter units would assemble, climb to altitude, prepare to attack the bomber stream, only to be intercepted by Mustangs before they could make contact. The Americans employed a tactic called fighter sweep, sending Mustang groups ahead of the bomber formations to clear the sky of defenders. Luftwaffe fighters found themselves forced into dogfights while the bombers flew past, untouched. If the Germans ignored the Mustangs and pressed on toward the bombers, the American fighters would tear into them from behind, ripping apart formations, shooting down aircraft whose pilots were fixated on the heavy bombers and oblivious to the threat closing from their 6 o'clock. It was a tactical nightmare with no solution. If you engaged the Mustangs, the bombers got through. If you ignored the Mustangs, you died. Either way, the bombs fell. By April 1944, Luftwaffe day fighter losses had reached catastrophic levels, over 400 pilots killed or missing in a single month. Replacement pilots arrived at frontline units with as little as 30 hours of flight time, compared to the 200-plus hours that had been standard earlier in the war. These novices were thrown into combat against American pilots who had flown across the Atlantic, who had hundreds of hours in type, who had trained in an environment where fuel and aircraft were abundant. The results were predictable. Green German pilots would make a single mistake, lose sight of their wingman, climb too steeply, focus on one target too long, and die without ever understanding what killed them. A Mustang pilot would appear as if from nowhere, fire a 2-second burst, and the German fighter would disintegrate or spin earthward trailing smoke. Kill ratios became lopsided beyond anything seen earlier in the war. In some engagements, the Americans lost 1 fighter for every 10 they destroyed. Surviving German pilots spoke of the Mustangs with a mixture of respect and dread. The aircraft was fast, faster than a Bamas 109 in a dive, faster than an F-foot 190 in level flight. It could outturn both German types at high altitude. Its rate of roll was phenomenal, allowing it to reverse direction faster than an opponent could track. And most terrifying of all, it seemed to be everywhere. You could shoot down 1 Mustang, look around, and see 5 more. Major Heinz Baer, a 220 victory ace, described combat against Mustangs as fighting ghosts. He elaborated, they would appear from nowhere, engage for 30 seconds, and vanish before you could organize a response. By the time you turned to face them, they were behind you again. It was like fighting an enemy who could see the future. This was not far from the truth. American pilots had superior situational awareness thanks to better cockpit visibility, better training in tactical formations, and better radios allowing coordinated maneuvers. But more than that, they had fuel. A German pilot had to watch his fuel gauge constantly, knowing that he had perhaps 20 minutes of combat endurance before he must disengage and head home. A Mustang pilot could loiter over the target area for an hour, waiting for Germans to appear, engaging at will, breaking off if the situation turned unfavorable, returning minutes later to re-engage. It was warfare with an unlimited bank account versus an adversary counting pennies. After Hans-Ekkehard Bob's initial inspection of the captured Mustang, the aircraft was transferred to the Luftwaffe test center at Rechlin for comprehensive evaluation. Test pilots flew it against P-109Gs and F-190s in mock combat. Engineers disassembled the engine, studied the fuel system, measured every dimension. Aerodynamicists analyzed the wing profile and marveled at the laminar flow design, a feature that reduced drag by maintaining smooth airflow over the wing's surface for a greater percentage of its chord. The reports that emerged from Rechlin were detailed, professional, and devastating. In terms of speed, the Mustang was superior to all German fighters except the new jet-powered Me 262, which was still plagued by engine reliability issues. In terms of range, the Mustang had no equivalent in the Luftwaffe inventory, not even close. German fighters were designed for point defense of the Reich, launching from bases inside Germany to intercept incoming raids. They were built for short-duration, high-intensity combat. The P-51 was built for power projection, for escorting bombers across a continent, for staying in the fight when everyone else had to go home. But the most damning finding was not about performance. It was about manufacturing. The engineers at Rechlin noted that the Mustang's construction was optimized for mass production. Components were modular, interchangeable, designed to be assembled by semi-skilled workers in enormous factories. The tolerances were tight, but not excessively so, no tighter than necessary to achieve the design performance. The result was an aircraft that could be produced quickly, cheaply, and in vast quantities without sacrificing quality. By contrast, German fighters like the Bf-109 and Fu-190 were masterpieces of precision engineering. They required skilled machinists, hand-fitted parts, and extensive quality control. They were beautiful, effective, and utterly unsuited to the industrial warfare of 1944. Germany could produce perhaps 1,000 fighters per month. The United States was producing 3,000 Mustangs per month, and that was just one type among many. One Rechlin engineer, in a moment of unguarded honesty, wrote in his evaluation, "This is not an aircraft, it is a factory's declaration of war." He was right. The Mustang was not just a machine. It was a philosophy made physical. It embodied a way of thinking about warfare that prioritized sustainability over elegance, mass over perfection, the long campaign over the brilliant sortie. It said, "We will build 10,000 of these, and we will keep building them until you have nothing left to shoot them down with." There is a peculiar symbolism in the Mustang's appearance, its bare aluminum skin polished to a mirror shine, reflecting sunlight like liquid silver. Early in the war, aircraft were camouflaged, painted in greens and grays to blend with earth and sky. But by 1944, American fighters flew unpainted. The weight savings from omitting paint improved performance. Yes, but the decision was also psychological. Flying unpainted was a statement. We do not need to hide. German pilots came to recognize those silver swarms from miles away. They would spot the glint of sunlight on aluminum and know what was coming. There was no mistaking a formation of Mustangs for anything else, not Spitfires, not Thunderbolts, not anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. The Mustangs announced their presence, daring you to engage, confident that when the fight was over, they would still be there, and you would not. This visual signature became a symbol of American material abundance. The Germans painted their fighters in elaborate camouflage schemes because they had to, because they operated from hidden airfields, because survival depended on not being spotted. The Americans flew in bare metal because they could afford to be seen. They had air superiority. They had numbers. They had fuel. They could fight on their terms. Captured German pilots, when shown photographs of American aircraft production facilities, often reacted with disbelief. The images showed assembly lines stretching for hundreds of yards, aircraft moving down the line in stages, a completed fighter rolling off every few minutes. It looked less like an aviation factory and more like a force of nature, an industrial hurricane that could not be stopped, only endured. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, perhaps the finest fighter tactician the Luftwaffe produced, understood this better than most. In 1944, he proposed to Hitler that Germany cease all bomber production and focus entirely on fighters build 5,000 fighters per month, and swarm the American bomber formations with such numbers that even escorted raids would suffer unsustainable losses. Hitler refused. He wanted bombers for retaliation, for terror, for the symbolic value of striking back at England. Galland returned to his headquarters and told his staff, "We have lost. Not because German fighters were inferior. They were not. Not because German pilots lacked courage. They possessed it in abundance, but because the arithmetic was impossible. You could shoot down 10 Mustangs and 20 would appear the next day. You could destroy an entire American fighter group, and it would be rebuilt within a week." The Americans were not fighting a war of skill or courage. They were fighting a war of production, and production was a game Germany could not win. For German pilots who had fought since 1939, who had swept aside Polish, French, and British opposition in the war's early years, the Mustang represented a profound psychological transformation. In 1940, the Luftwaffe was the world's most formidable air force, experienced, tactically sophisticated, equipped with excellent aircraft. Luftwaffe pilots had every reason to believe in their superiority. By 1944, that belief was ash. It was not one thing. It was the accumulation of 1,000 small revelations. It was seeing Mustangs over Berlin and realizing there was no sanctuary. It was watching a novice American pilot make mistakes that should have been fatal, yet survive because his aircraft was faster and could disengage at will. It was landing after a mission and learning that your wingman was dead, your squadron commander was dead, the pilot you trained with last month was dead. It was the slow, grinding understanding that skill and experience mattered less and less when the enemy could afford to learn from his mistakes and you could not. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a veteran with 176 victories, wrote in his diary in April 1944, "We are no longer fighting pilots, we are fighting machines, and the machines are winning." This was the essence of the transformation. Early in the war, air combat was personal, almost chivalric, individual pilots testing their skill against one another in a three-dimensional arena. By 1944, it had become industrial, impersonal, a matter of tonnage and production capacity. The Mustang was the avatar of this new reality. It was not flown by aces. It did not need to be. It was flown by competent pilots who followed doctrine, who flew in coordinated formations, who trusted that if they were killed, another pilot in another identical aircraft would take their place and the mission would continue. This was terrifying in a way that mere danger was not. Danger you could face, production capacity you could not. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. By that time, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Its remaining aircraft were grounded for lack of fuel. Its pilots were dead, captured, or scattered. In the final weeks, Mi-262 jet fighters, aircraft that in theory could have challenged the Mustangs, flew a handful of missions before their bases were overrun. They were too few, too late, too starved of resources to matter. The P-51 Mustang had flown its final combat missions, but its legacy was just beginning. After the war, Mustangs served in air forces around the world. They flew in Korea, where they were used for ground attack and interdiction. They were operated by dozens of nations, from Israel to Australia to Sweden, serving into the 1980s in some cases. Racing enthusiasts discovered that surplus Mustangs, with modified engines and stripped interiors, could reach speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. To this day, P-51s are among the most sought-after warbirds, prized for their beauty, their handling, and their place in history. But the deeper legacy is less tangible. The Mustang proved a principle that shaped military aviation for the next 80 years, that range is a weapon, that strategic reach matters more than raw performance, that an aircraft capable of projecting power across a continent is worth more than a dozen aircraft that can fight only over their own airfields. This principle influenced every long-range fighter, every air superiority platform, every strategic doctrine developed by Western air forces in the decades that followed. When Hans-Ekkehard Bob sat in that cockpit in March 1944, he understood he was not merely examining an enemy aircraft, he was seeing the future. A future where wars would be won, not by the side with the bravest pilots or the most elegant engineering, but by the side with the industrial capacity to sustain a long campaign. A future where abundance mattered more than excellence. This was the lesson the Luftwaffe learned too late. That in total war, production is strategy. The Mustang was a beautiful aircraft. Its lines were graceful, its performance exceptional, its handling legendary, but it was not beauty that made it decisive. It was repeatability. It was the fact that North American aviation, operating factories in California and Texas, could build them faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. It was the fact that an American pilot could fly one over Berlin, have it shot full of holes, bail out, and land behind friendly lines 2 months later to find an identical aircraft waiting for him. That was the true terror of the Mustang. Not that it was unbeatable, it was not. German pilots shot down hundreds of them. But every one that fell was immediately replaced. Every pilot lost was replaced. The Silver Swarm kept coming, and there was no force in the Reich capable of stopping it. In post-war interviews, Luftwaffe veterans were often asked what aircraft they feared most. The answers varied. Some said the Soviet Yak-9. Some said the Typhoon rocket fighter. Some said the later model Spitfires. But when asked what symbol defined their defeat, they almost universally named the Mustang, not because it was invincible, because it was inevitable. There is a photograph taken at a German airfield in May 1945, after the surrender. In the foreground, a burned-out Foot 190 sits on its belly, tail section blown off, wings buckled. In the background, a formation of P-51 Save flies overhead in perfect parade formation, their aluminum skins flashing in the sunlight. The contrast is stark, wreckage below, silver wings above. One German mechanic who witnessed this scene later described it as the moment he truly understood the war was over. Not when Berlin fell, not when Hitler was dead, but when he saw those silver aircraft, unscathed, abundant, arrogant in their visibility, and realized they represented a power that his nation could never match. The Mustang did not win the war alone. No single weapon system ever does. But it was the clearest physical manifestation of the industrial and philosophical gulf between the Allies and the Axis. It said, "We have enough fuel, enough aluminum, enough engines, enough pilots, enough will. We will grind you down, not with brilliance, but with persistence." Edgar Schmid, the engineer who designed the Mustang, never claimed to have created a masterpiece. In interviews, he spoke of the aircraft as a solution to a problem. How to build a long-range escort fighter quickly and in large numbers. It was pragmatic, not artistic. It was designed to be manufactured, to be flown by average pilots, to be maintained in the field with basic tools. And that, in the end, was the genius of it. The Luftwaffe built aircraft for aces. The Americans built aircraft for everyone. The Luftwaffe optimized for excellence. The Americans optimized for scale. In a war measured not in days or weeks, but in years, scale won. When Bob climbed out of that captured Mustang in March 1944, he filed his report and returned to duty. He flew combat missions for another year, survived the war, lived until 2013. In his memoirs, he wrote about many aircraft, many battles, many moments of fear and triumph. But when he wrote about the Mustang, his tone changed. It was not the tone of a warrior respecting a worthy opponent. It was the tone of a man who had seen the future and understood his place in it. "We were the past," he wrote. "They were what came next." Those silver wings carried more than bombs and bullets. They carried a message written in aluminum and fuel, and the hum of Merlin engines, that the side which can build, sustain, and replace will outlast the side that relies on genius. That abundance is a form of invincibility. That the factory in the end is mightier than the ace. The Mustang made that message visible, and once seen, it could never be unseen.